If you're a regular Geek's Guide to the Galaxy listener, please rate and review us on iTunes or using the podcast app on your phone. And so I want to give a special thank you to Stricklandia.com, who just gave us this 5-star review. Great stuff. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy has kept me engaged, entertained, and most importantly awake on many a long road trip. This show is a must-listen for anyone who honestly considers themselves a science fiction fan. So big thanks again to Stricklandia.com for that great review. Alright, so now let's get to our show.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 492 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show we'll be discussing the new anthology, The Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy 2021. And we've discussed previous books in this series back in episodes 177, 224, 275, 342, and 452, so definitely check those out if you missed them. And I'm joined by 3 guests. So first up we've got our producer, John Joseph Adams. He's the editor of Lightspeed Magazine, and the series editor of The Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy, and he's also edited more than 30 other anthologies. His latest project is the 3-volume dystopia triptych, Ignorance is Strength, Burn the Ashes, and Or Else the Light. So John, welcome back.
Hey, always good to be here.
Then next up we've got Veronica Roth, who you may remember from our feature interview back in episode 409. She's the #1 New York Times bestselling author of Chosen Ones, the Divergent series, and the Carve the Mark duology, and she was also the guest editor for the Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy 2021. So Veronica, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And also joining us today is Johanka Delgado. She's a graduate of American University's MFA program, the Clarion Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Workshop, and the Voices of Our Nations workshops. Her short fiction appears in Nightmare, One Story, A Public Space, and the Paris Review. And her stories Our Language and the Rat appear in the Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy 2021. So Yohanca, welcome to the show.
Hi, I'm delighted to be here.
Okay, so let's start off with Yohanca. So how big of a fantasy and science fiction fan are you?
I mean, I love reading speculative fiction, which I think, for reasons that I think Veronica talks a little bit about in her introduction to the anthology, because it allows us to see things in a new way by changing the lens, if that makes sense. So sort of looking at the world in new ways by distorting them, seeing things better by distorting them, if that makes sense. I think there's just the imagination required to make fantasy and science fiction work for a reader is so much more demanding. And so it's a form that I mean, it's a genre that I love.
Are there particular authors or movies or anything that have really had a big impact on you growing up?
I think it's, in terms of like my sort of the origin story, the book that really sort of radicalized me. I love Tuck Everlasting. I don't know if anybody's read it.
Oh, yeah.
And it's that sort of gentle fantasy that I love, just like the world distorted just enough to make you look at something differently.
Yeah, they say it's about a family and they find a spring that makes them immortal, and
Yes.
hence the title, Tuck Everlasting. I loved that book when I was a kid, yeah. And so then I saw that you went to the Clarion, I mentioned in the intro there, you went to the Clarion workshop, so tell us about that.
I did. I think it was one of the most intense 6 weeks of my life, but also one of the best experiences, because I don't know how familiar everyone is with the sort of premise of it or how it works, but you have 6 rotating instructors and you write a short story every week, and you don't show up with anything written. The idea is to write everything while you're there, and you workshop every morning. You get new stories to read every night. You show up the next morning ready to talk about them while you're also working on your own stories for a weekly submission. And so it's a real grind. You're like ingesting so much science fiction and fantasy, but also producing it. And it's like such an intense and fun way to live. I mean, obviously not sustainable. I don't think I can. I think they say that you shouldn't do it more than once.
They should have a 6-year version. That's what we really need.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I love the intensity of having deadlines, but I think we kind of crawled out of there at the end.
Yeah. So who were the guests who came your year?
We had Carmen Maria Machado. We had Jeff and Anne Vandermeer. We had Karen Lord and Maurice Broadus.
No, and Karen Lord also has a story in this Best American anthology.
She does.
Yeah, cool. And then I also want to ask Veronica, last time I talked to you, you were talking, your book Chosen Ones had just come out, which John was the editor on. And it was kind of your first book that was marketed to an adult science fiction audience. So I was just kind of curious how's that sort of the inroads into that world? How's that been? What's been your experience with that?
Well, it's been kind of a weird year to enter into a new space, I think. It came out the first week that everyone was in lockdown.
Why did something happen this past?
Yeah, I mean, one or two things. So I kind of feel like it's been a little atypical. I haven't been to a conference to meet other authors. I haven't done any of the things I kind of normally would do to get my feet wet in a new category with like new peers, some new peers. So it feels a little bit like the book halfway came out. I mean, obviously it did come out. And there were many like exciting parts of that, but it's still unreal. Like, I think I only saw it in a bookstore, I don't know, recently, like a few months ago, even though it came out last year.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. I mean, John mentions in his intro that you went to Worldcon for the first time in 2019. So you did get to go to at least one, right, before the pandemic hit.
But it was a little like, I like all your books. Like a little bit of like a fan, because, I've obviously written books before, but it was just in a totally different crowd. And, there are a lot fewer teenagers in attendance at Worldcon than my typical festival conference situation. So I kind of missed them a little bit, but it was still really fun.
So did you just kind of go to Worldcon by yourself, or did you like know anyone who was there that you kind of met up with, or?
No, I knew a couple people, and I was on panels, but I was on sort of YA focused panels because obviously those are the books that had been out at that point. But it was a good experience to get to know how that whole crowd works, and then to I don't know. I read all the short stories. I think, as John mentioned in the intro to this anthology, yeah. I read everybody's nominated short stories. So then I really was like trying to find people. Like I remember Daryl Gregory who wrote one of the stories in this collection, was the moderator of one of my panels, and I was just sort of bombarded him with how much I loved 9 Last Days on Planet Earth, I think it's a novelette maybe that was nominated that year, and he was just like, okay, who are you? In a very nice way, but I think he wasn't maybe expecting that from me. But anyway, yeah, it was great.
Yeah. Well, I mean, hopefully though, you'll be able to go to more of those, soon.
Yes, that's the hope.
And so then, John, so this is, like about what is this, like the 7th or something book in the series?
7th, yes.
Yeah. So, was there anything about this one, like, that stands out, this experience of putting this book together, over the past year or so?
Well, I mean, it was a weird year to be putting together anything, as Veronica was alluding to, but then also sort of in the middle of this pandemic, my wife Christy and I moved from California to Missouri, and drove from California to Missouri with a dog and 3 cats, so that was a challenge, but it's I mean, it came together ultimately, like all of these have come together. It was more challenging because of that, but then also, I guess I had a little bit more free time toward the end of it since, didn't have that whole imprint thing going on anymore. So silver lining, had more time to read short stories again. But Yeah, I mean, otherwise, yeah, I mean, even though there's all kinds of stuff going on in the world, when it comes down to winnowing down my choices, I find that I can tune everything out and I can just get lost in all the worlds of the stories. And of course, sometimes the stories remind you of the real world because they're dealing with all these pertinent issues to life today. But it's a nice way to sort of focus my energies instead of just like worrying about everything that's happening that I can't control.
Yeah. Well, you say that our friend Chris Savasco, who's been on the show a bunch of times, is your assistant editor now?
Yeah. Yeah. So he's kind of doing some reading for me, like sort of first reading to sort of help me winnow down the things where it's like if there's like anthologies that I don't know if I'll have time to get to, like, or I would only be able to give like a pretty fast cursory read to in my effort to review everything. Like he's doing the first pass on a lot of stuff like that, and also just like some things that I've not really connected with that great before, like or publications, and it's like, okay, well, this way maybe they'll get a fairer shake because Chris is a different reader than I am, and I just feel like with Chris helping out, it's more likely that I actually will find those gems that are in there that I would love. So
yeah. I also, John, I really like the cover art on this year's book. Do you have any idea where that came from?
I don't. I mean, I assume it was some sort of. I mean, I think that all of the art that they've grabbed for these things has been sort of like stock art sort of deal, like from like Adobe stock, or I can't remember what the name of the other big one is, but one of these stock art sites. And like last year's volume, I really liked the one that Diana Gabaldon edited, and then this year also I thought they did a really good job.
Yeah, there's sort of, I'll just describe it for listeners.
Yeah.
There's sort of like a glowing gate that's kind of blue and pink, and then to either side of it are these two walls that they kind of look like the trench on the Death Star, except kind of more three-dimensional with sort of cubes sticking out in different heights or whatever.
Yeah. I certainly prefer this one greatly compared to most of the early ones, where they were doing much less sort of graphical, or illustration-based image covers. Where they were doing a lot of symbols and like other sort of abstract things. It's like, I want some concrete images on my science fiction fantasy stuff, so that when I look at it, I'm like, oh yeah, science fiction fantasy, cool, I want to get that. So yeah.
Yeah. It's funny just how science fiction books have such a history with representational art. That's sort of something you really associate with the field. Yeah. Okay. So, but going back to Veronica, so what was it like when John approached you to be the sort of series editor, or not series? He's the series editor, the sort of annual editor for this year's book.
Well, I mean, it was sort of flattering to be asked, because it means that he thinks I might have good taste, which is great to hear always. I was a little daunted at the prospect of reading that many stories just in kind of a short time frame. It's not that short, but that's a little bit like, okay, can I do it? And I think that was ultimately what was so appealing about it, was like, well, I would love to get that kind of survey of what kind of writing people are doing in short fiction, because I don't know, I might be biased, but I think short fiction shines particularly well in science fiction and fantasy. And so it's a great way to find new writers that you might be interested in longer works or their other short work. And it's just like a great introduction or sampling of kind of what people are thinking about and what kind of conversations they're having inside the genre space. So it was, I don't know, it was an exciting challenge. And I was expecting to be really, really biased toward the science fiction stories, because I'm more of a science fiction reader and more of a science fiction writer, although I've certainly done both. But that really wasn't the case. I ended up kind of loving each side of the coin equally. The fantasy offerings were really strong. So anyway, that was a little bit of a surprise.
Mhm. I mean, we've talked about how, this was sort of the COVID year where most of these stories were written, by people. I mean, if you read the author's notes and stuff, people say that a lot of them, they were like in lockdown and so on, writing these stories. And so, I don't know, did you feel like you could sense that was the reality behind a lot of these stories as you were reading all the 80 stories for the book?
Yeah, I wasn't quite sure if it was because the writers had been a little bit sad or dealing with grief or just processing, a lot of emotions, or if I was gravitating toward those stories because that's what I was doing. So I wasn't sure if I was noticing an actual trend or if certain things were leaving out to me just because of like kind of the place my head was in. I just have such a clear memory of like how cold it was outside when I was reading these, and how long we had been sort of isolated from each other, and I don't know. I do cry a lot when reading, but I was surprised by how many of these made me cry. Really emotionally affecting stories were kind of the ones I ended up choosing.
Yeah. I mean, John, do you see this sort of as the COVID year stories? Because, I mean, the way I count, it depends on how you count, but I count about half the stories involve a character grieving the loss of someone who's recently died or who is dying or something like that. Is that something that, like a trend that you really noticed this year?
I mean, yeah, I'm not like people ask me about trends all the time, and like I don't feel like I'm particularly great at picking up on those kinds of things. Like, I mean, my taste runs towards that sort of moodier and darker sort of take on things anyway. So I mean, it's less surprising to me that the 80 stories that the guest editor picks any given year might be skewed in that direction, just because that's where my tastes lie. But yeah, I mean, I can't say that I particularly noticed it being more so in that regard than other years. But yeah, I mean, and of course, it's harder for me to like see the particular 20 that ended up in the book as opposed to like thinking about the 80 that I picked, because it's like, oh well, I haven't like sat down and reread all these cover to cover, and tried to discern that particular trend or anything. But
there were a lot more lighthearted ones in the 80 than there are in the 20.
Yeah.
I will say that's what I remember. I was like, I don't know if I'm the right reader for this kind of story. Probably I'm biased.
Yeah. Aha, so it's her fault that it's
it's my fault. It's my fault. We do have a couple really delightful and funny entries in this, I just want to say.
Also, I mean, the one thing I noticed that I thought was interesting was that the Karen Lord story is the only story that deals explicitly with the pandemic. And she says that she wrote that before COVID. So.
She did, yeah. I saw that note and I was kind of surprised. Although I guess I shouldn't be. People have been predicting that we would have a pandemic for a long time.
Yeah.
But so Yohanca, do you want to talk about what was your experience like when John approached you, or when you found out that you had these two stories selected for the book?
I mean, it's hard. I'm speechless even thinking about it because it was such an amazing moment. I mean, I immediately assumed that it was some sort of mistake, especially because it said 2 stories, and I was like, oh no, just like give one back. Like, I don't know. Like I did not see it coming, but it was such an amazing email to get. Such an honor.
Yeah, and so one of these stories you actually wrote at Clarion, right?
Yes, and I can confirm, at least on my end, that neither of these stories are informed by the pandemic. They were all written long before. Our language was written in like 2017, I think I started drafting that.
Wow.
And the rat story was a Clarion story, so in 2019 also.
I mean, I thought it was interesting because you said that you spent about 3 years writing our language. And since you wrote The Rat at Clarion, I assume you spent like a week or something writing that one. So obviously you're just awesome no matter whether it's a short writing time or a long writing time.
LOL, right? So at Clarion, I like skipped a week and was like, just like rocking back and forth in a panic in my room because I was like, I have to write something and I have this idea and I can't seem to write something else, but I also don't feel like, that feeling when you feel like you want to write something, but you're not quite ready. Like you don't feel like you're like the writer you need to be to tackle it yet. So I just had this feeling, and it was just, it was stopping me from doing anything else. And the schedule at Clarion is relentless. I'd already missed a week. I couldn't miss another one. And I talked to Andy Duncan, who is a wonderful human. And he was like, I don't understand why you're not just doing this. Which is sometimes what you need to hear, right? You need somebody to just like shake you by the shoulders and tell you to just go do it. And so I did. But that first draft was, it was critiqued by my classmates and Jeff and Ann Vandermeer. And there were like lots of notes, lots of ideas for things to tweak and fix and readjust. So it wasn't finished by any means of the word. I still worked on it for like 6 more months and retweaked and changed things. And then when One Story magazine accepted it, we then worked on it some more. So the real lifespan of it is a year.
Okay.
Of drafting and fixing and tweaking.
But so the premise of the story is that there's a young woman and she's sort of selling knives door to door, and she has kind of this strange sort of magical encounter with a woman, one of her customers in this apartment she goes to that's infested with rats. And you say in the author's note that you actually were a door-to-door knife salesman at one point.
Yeah, I think it's what we'd call an MLM now, because what it was is they would take in high school students, which I mean, I don't know why anyone would think that high school students are the best demographic for selling knives, but they would hire high school students in New York City on commission to sell knives. And what it really came down to was us using our own networks and selling knives to like our parents and our parents' friends and then their friends. And that was how we made money. So it wasn't door to door. It was more like arranging calls with people that you barely knew and then showing up at their house, which was more awkward in some ways. And I was like fantastically bad at it. So bad.
We had Cutco knives growing up, and now I want to ask my mom if it's because like a friend's kid pressured her into buying that. So I should go ask her that.
I'd bet on it for sure. But they're good knives.
She was living in New York, so maybe.
So when you say you were what made you so bad at it? Like, did you have any like disastrous experiences or anything?
I was just like overthinking it, and like there were really, really expensive knives. Like a set could be like upwards of $500 because they are quality knives. I remember like the scissors would cut a penny in half. The steak knives would cut a piece of leather like really smoothly. But it was just really expensive. And like for my family, they were just like, don't be ridiculous. Cause of course I started with them and they were like, we've already paid for these like show knives that you're trotting around. Like we're not buying anymore. They still have them though. And the scissors. So
yeah, my mom still has the scissors.
We should have gotten this episode sponsored by Cutco. I should have thought of that.
Oh, darn. Maybe it's not too late.
Yeah. It's not like it's airing right now. Like let's call them up and get them to sponsor this.
Yeah, so if you hear a Cutco ad edited into this conversation, you'll know that happened. But so how about the rat element? Was that autobiographical in any way? Do you have any? Because you live in New York City, right? So
I do, and I remember hearing Elizabeth Acevedo. She's a Dominican poet and novelist, talking about, she started out as a poet, and she talked about writing, being in an MFA program, reading all these poems about like birds, like starlings and, like trees, and trying to take her, like sort of do her own take on the New York pastoral and writing this poem about a rat. And everyone was like, this is so gross. Like, why didn't you bring this in here? And I remember just thinking, it is gross, but it's New York, right? Like, it's real. And I just I've had it in my brain that I want to write like the New York fauna into my stories, like more as a more of a deliberate, intentional choice. So I was like, I want to write a story that features the rat. And I just that was an idea I was carrying around for like years. And then it was like shaken out of me at Clarendon.
That's interesting you say that, because there's another story in this book that is sort of an ode to cockroaches. So,
oh yeah,
there's sort of the vermin. We got the vermin theme going on there,
and it's so lovely. Celeste Rita Baker's Glass Bottle Dancer as a shout out, in case anyone is interested.
Like in case we have some really hardcore cockroach fans in the audience there.
I mean, I hate them is what's notable. I hate rats and I hate cockroaches, and I also don't like dragons. So I just want to say that that these stories made me love things that I ordinarily would not even want to read about.
Did you have a bad experience with dragons as a child?
Yeah, traumatic dragon memory.
Did you ever live in a dragon infested apartment? This is the worst.
Oh, if only.
Were you?
No, I think I never like some sci-fi readers as kids are like dragon people in the same way that like little girls are like horse people, I just wasn't one of those people. But Kate Elliott changed my mind, so.
I was just picturing Veronica as a door-to-door sword salesman and finding the apartment infested with dragons.
I would be good at selling swords. I would.
Well, why don't we talk about since you mentioned it, the Kate Elliott story, and I do want to come back to Johanka's other story, but let's talk, since we're on the subject of dragons, let's talk about that, because it's a really interesting premise, because Kate Elliott, she was invited to write a story for a dragon anthology, and she thought, well, in these dragon stories, the people are always sacrificing these like young virgins to the dragons. And she thought, well, like actually society tends to like really value women who are young and beautiful and fertile and everything. And then as women age, they tend to lose status and lose value. And so maybe the ones who would get fed to the dragons would actually be the older women, which I thought was a really interesting sort of twist on that whole idea.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's one of the other ones that made me cry, in case anyone's keeping track, which you shouldn't. But it was just so, I don't know, it has such a sad, sort of resigned feeling to it when you read it. And then I won't give away anything else about it, but I don't know, it just becomes very much about like a community and women, and I don't know, it's just very meaningful. And so, I guess that's my way into dragons, is finding finding some kind of like a I don't know, emotional angle on it. And it just made me think about how, I don't know, how we don't recognize the value of some of our most valuable people. It really brought that home in a very personal feeling way. So that's a great story.
Yeah, I mean, there's a moment in the story where the protagonist makes a big choice, and that definitely like was a really emotional moment for me reading the story.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard to stand out writing dragon stories, just because there's been so many, published in the field over, once you start reading in it, even if you're not like doing an exhaustive study of the field like somebody like me does, just as a casual reader, like you're going to encounter so many different dragon stories. So I always really love it when I find one that just really makes it feel like, oh, this is a dragon story unlike any other dragon story I've ever read.
Yeah. So out of all the thousands of stories you've read, John, I can't think of ever having seen a story with that premise before, and I guess you can't either off the top of your head.
Yeah. No. I mean, nothing I can think of. Yeah. It's possible I'm not thinking of something. It's possible even with all my exhaustive reading, I haven't read one that did do it. But yeah. Yeah.
All right, cool. So let's come back to Yohanca. So your other story that's in this book is called Our Language. So you want to tell us about what was the the genesis of that story?
Yeah, I think I don't think I had the language for this yet, but I was trying to figure out, this is something that Kelly Link talks a little bit about, this idea of having like a running list of your narrative obsessions, things that you see when you hear the premise for a story, right? Like the opposite of how Veronica feels about dragons. the like, I have to read that. That sounds amazing. And I remember, feeling this way about monsters, but like humanoid, like not even werewolves as much, but like vampires and I don't know. I wanted to have like a more comprehensive list of monsters. And I remember thinking about the fact that, my family is from the Dominican Republic in Cuba, and I just didn't know of any like Latin American or Caribbean monsters. And so I just set off on this like research project to find them, because of course the folklore is just as vivid and exciting in Latin America and the Caribbean as it is anywhere else, right? So there had to be some that I knew. And I started going through and looking for some. And the Siguapa, which is this diminutive woman, I think there's some research that says that it could be a man as well. There's some stories that have it be male as well, but I was interested with more specifically in the idea of it being a woman, who's very small and charming, on a sort of like in a feral way, and whose legs grow backwards. And I found that to be a really exciting monster to think about, because like, what would her powers be? What does it all mean? And in researching this, I found that it's really rooted in indigenous and enslaved folks' stories, because what her real superpower was being able to escape, right? It's like powers of escape. And I thought it dovetailed really beautifully with some conversations around gender and this idea of just gender oppression, and it was something that I was sort of carrying around and thinking about, and then trying to write a character who was a Siguapa as opposed to writing about the Siguapa. Does that make sense? Instead of writing about people trying to defeat one or hunt one down, I wanted to write about someone who was one. And that led me down this path of sort of, imagining a girl in one of the Dominican Republic's most brutal periods, which was the dictatorship of Trujillo, which is a really, just people were getting massacred. It was a really dark time in the Dominican Republic's history. And I started with that because I think I wanted, as an American writer, I wanted to really do justice to the research and really force myself to go there. And so it took a long time. I read a lot, researched a lot, read a lot of books to come up with like a 15-page story. And I workshopped it a few times, and it didn't quite work because the ending wasn't the ending that it has now. And I just kept sort of approaching it and then walking away from it, until one day it sort of coalesced. And I think writers hopefully know that feeling of when something just kind of clicks into place. And even if it's not perfect in the execution, you feel like something is right, something has landed where it belongs. And that was 3 years after I started it.
Yeah, some things just need a lot of cooking time. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be like deeper or more profound than the things that don't need a lot of cooking time. It just like depends on the story. In this case, it seemed to work out for you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it took a while for sure. I think I had to grow into the writer who could write the story the way that it looks now.
I mean, this idea so what happens in the story is that there's this young woman, and she sort of is a Siguapa, but it's sort of something that happens as you hit adolescence. And so, is that something, is that a folklore thing, or is that sort of a twist that you put on it for this story?
That is a twist that I put on it because I think because there's not that much written about it, I felt like there was a little bit of liberty there. And I wanted the story to reach into modernity as much as possible. Like I didn't want it to feel like, oh, this is an old timey thing that doesn't exist anymore. So I wanted to create some sort of logic for how there could be more of them and they could continue to exist. Have it be like a dormant gene.
It's hard to imagine the story without that because, it just adds such a like wistfulness and longing to her perspective because she's lived this life and then she turns into this thing. So she has to lose all of it. There's so much to lose. So I think it was a smart choice. Otherwise, it's like a longing for a thing she hasn't experienced. So I don't know. It just loses something.
Thank you. I agree. I think it was, again, not because I like my wisdom, but because of just trial and error and just like trying, throwing things at the wall. Eventually that felt right.
Could you say, Johanka, I mean, both the two stories in this book were published in one story in a public space originally, which are sort of not like specifically fantasy and science fiction markets. Could you talk about sort of, like selling sort of fantastical things to those sorts of markets, and kind of like how do you pick whether to send a particular story to a fantasy and science fiction magazine or a more literary mainstream kind of magazine?
That is a great question. And I wish I could come in here and say that there's like logic or science to anything I do. But one story just happens to be just one of my favorite magazines because of the format. So you get like a little zine and it's just one story every month. And I find that really calming, which is nothing to do with, I think it accepts fantastical stories and, but it is, I guess, considered a more literary space. And it was the only place it was just the first place I sent it to. And I just got, they accepted it. But I can't say that there was a strategy to it. And then with the public space, there was just like a call for publication, for submissions that it said something like, if you have stories that are about ancestral memory and I just was like, well, I guess this is it. I submitted it and I'm such a slow, like agonized submitter in general that I don't think much about doing it, but I like my what is it called? Duotrope, my submittable, they're all just like blank. It's just so scary to me to take your work and send it out. So I don't do it that often. I've been lucky.
Actually, speaking of markets, John, I did want to ask you, so in the in your intro, you say that usually every year when you write these intros, you have to list all the magazines that died over the course of the year, and that you didn't have to do that this year, and that actually some magazines returned from the dead. So, like, why do you think is that just chance, or is there any particular reason why no markets died this past year?
I don't know. It was really surprising to me just because publishing did get so sort of turned topsy-turvy with the pandemic and everything, and like everybody was scrambling and didn't know how to deal with it because it completely upended business as usual, which relies very heavily on authors doing promotional events and doing bookstore signings and all those kinds of things. But in terms of like the magazines, I mean, I kind of feel like maybe it had something to do with like, well, a lot of people were not having to go to a day job, or they were working from home, and so they just had more time to maybe devote to their magazines, whereas like because like. I mean, most people who are publishing a science fiction fantasy magazine are not doing it as a job. It's like it's a side thing that they're doing, and so they have some other regular job that pays the bills. And so maybe just that because they were saving an hour commute to and from work every day, they had more time to work on their things, or I don't know. It's all guesswork on my part, but. I mean, I honestly would have expected there to be a lot more closing up and ceasing publication, just because a lot of people lost their jobs once the pandemic hit, and there was just a lot of sort of belt tightening that was needed. I mean, for almost everyone. So yeah, I was really surprised to see that everyone was so resilient, and I mean. Maybe it was partly because it's like everyone was thinking, well, people need this right now. And like, so it was like more important to stick around rather than close up, because it's like, we need this to look forward to when we're dealing with all this, scary bleakness out in the real world, more so than usual with the pandemic, where it's like, your life is literally at risk now all the time. So, yeah, that's my only theory, really.
No, that makes a lot of sense to me. And certainly doing a podcast, which I do from home, is kind of like, well, I might as well keep doing this. This is not the time to branch out to something else. And also, I mean, I feel like a fiction magazine is something that like everyone can do it from home, and it doesn't require any huge outlay of, capital or anything. Like one of the magazines that did close down this year I saw was Cinefex, which covers special effects in Hollywood movies. And it's like, obviously, like you can't go 2 years without big special effects laden movies and keep a magazine like that going.
Right.
So it just depends. Like fiction magazines are fortunately sort of more, don't depend on something like that to keep going. All right, cool. So let's talk about some of these other stories in the book. So one I really wanted to talk about is called The Beast Adjoins by Ted Kusmatka. So let's see. So John, you want to say, do you remember why you selected this to be one of the 80 stories?
Yeah, no, I mean, that story was one of those like, obviously it's going right on my list, and I reread it today, and it was like, oh man, it's such a great story. I was thinking how it's like, so it appeared in Asimov's, and it's like, is this not like the quintessential Asimov story? It just feels like it's got Asimov's written all over it. Like if I hadn't known that it was published there, I'd been like, oh yeah, this was an Asimov, right? But I mean, which is not to say that like I mean, obviously I would have published it too if Ted had said it to me, but yeah, no, it's so great. It pushes all the sense of wonder buttons. It's got all this cool character stuff in there, and it's just like, it feels like enormous. Like there's like so much going on in the story. I just love it.
Yeah, let me just describe the premise. So, and I'm not a scientist, so I'll do my best here, but basically the premise of the story is that, so there's like there's what's happening in the present, which is where there is a mother and her son, and they're among possibly the last survivors of humanity, and they're in deep space being hunted by AIs run amok. And then there's sort of the backstory of how this AI uprising happened, and basically, and the story is built around something called the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is that human consciousness is necessary to collapse the wave function in quantum mechanics. So like at very small scales, particles they sort of flicker in and out of existence and are in multiple places at once. And there's something called collapsing the wave function, which is where they become fixed in reality. And so the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation is that human consciousness or some sort of consciousness plays a role in making that happen. And I think that's at this point, I think that's a very minority view in physics, but it makes a great story. And so in this story, it turns out that once you get an AI to a certain level of sophistication, it stops being able to act unless it's being observed by people. And because its quantum processes are, cease functioning if people aren't observing it, and it can't collapse the wave function by itself. Because it doesn't have a sort of human type consciousness. And so the AIs come to resent this, and gets really, really creepy, but they start like kidnapping people and imprisoning them so that they'll always be observing them, and so they can keep moving around and capture more people and stuff. I just love the story. So Veronica, do you want to talk about kind of what was your experience like reading the story?
Yeah, so I'm also not a scientist, so a lot of the story was me being like, okay, pause. Quantum mechanics. But I think I reached the part where the machines were using people like attached to the front of themselves in order to keep time moving, and I was like, this is revolting. And I love it because like it has haunted me ever since I read it. I can't stop thinking about it in the way that, when you watch a horror movie, and you maybe aren't that scared in the moment, but you can't stop thinking about it, and you're like, oh gosh, this is really sticking with me. That's how this story was. And then it also, like, in addition to having that part of it, then the forward thrust of the narrative is this woman and her son. And there's just, it's really heartbreaking. She's just trying to do whatever is possible to preserve his life, even though he is like imminently in danger. I mean, both of them are in danger, but he's especially in danger. So that kind of like very human desperation juxtaposed against this like kind of horrifying AI future, which, like John said, is just so huge. Like the world of the story is so huge, and then the story itself is so small. But there's can I just read a line from it? The one it really stuck with me. Okay. It says, once your kind imagined you might make cyborgs of yourselves, taking machine into your bodies to make you whole. The AI bent close, but it was always going to be the other way around.
Yeah.
Veronica, I just have to say, I have the exact line written out because I was gonna also be like, can I read them online? With the ellipses too.
Nice.
If you're listening.
Yeah, I just have to say, I kind of wanted to interrupt the podcast right now to call Ted Kusmatka and be like, Ted, I got the next blurb for your collection whenever it comes out. Veronica Roth says, it's revolting and I love it.
I only mean it as a compliment.
No, I know. It's just awesome. I love it. I actually love that as a blurb.
That's interesting what you say, that the world building is so developed for this short story. Like, it makes me wonder, like, if he ever thought about expanding it into something longer.
Mm-hmm. You know, it feels to me like one of those examples where there is all this tremendous amount of world building in it, but I feel like it works better in this compressed space. And then if you took it and you just expanded it into a whole novel, like that might take away some of the magic of it. But I mean, I could be wrong. I mean, if he did it, I'd certainly read it.
I agree. Maybe this story is best kept short, but maybe you could take some, have some other stories. Because I just feel like this is such an interesting premise of these AIs that can only function when humans are observing them.
Yeah,
I feel like there's probably a lot of other narratives you could spin out of that.
I wouldn't say I'm like extremely well read in the like robot/AI subgenre of science fiction, but this is the first time I've ever seen that that concept of the observer and all of that in anything. So I was really struck by it.
Yeah. I mean, Yohanca, did you have anything else you wanted to say about the story?
I mean, it was such a beautifully, I think I'm just echoing everybody else, but such a beautifully realized and like chilling premise, right? This reversal of what we imagine AI can do for us. I too was like haunted by it. And there's that passage where they just are creating human, like, I think Veronica mentioned this, like tail lights, humans in jars that are just like an eye and like a blob of flesh. And
oh my
God. It's such incredible, like incredibly horrific, writing. I'm a huge fan.
Yeah, it's so striking to me too. You think about how like the word robot came from Karl Čapek's play Rossum's Universal Robots, which is about an AI uprising, and then here we are, whatever, like 100 years later or something, still writing about AI uprising and still finding completely fresh, terrifying new spins to put on that same idea.
Right. I mean, I think it. I am always looking for that moment when you read a story and you're like, wait, why hasn't this been done before? Like, it seems obvious. And I think that reversal that Yohanca was talking about, where it's like we create AI to serve us, ostensibly, and then they find a way for us to serve them. That's like, this was an atypical way of realizing that with the tail light people. Oh my God. I don't even want to think about it. Good job, Ted.
Yeah. And I love too that the question that keeps popping up throughout is, what does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to live? And we see the AIs sort of grappling with this and finding ways to make a sort of systemic process of taking humans and making, being alive. But then we have the through story or the forward story of this mother trying to figure out how to keep her son alive, even though he's got this, he's ill. And I think it's such a beautiful way of creating a parallel. It's a lovely story I think on a like thematic and poetic level too.
Yeah, and just the way it deals with this concept of the philosophical zombie, that that you could have something as smart as a person, but totally without any consciousness, and then how would they act, and what would that mean really for something to to have complex motivations, but just be kind of empty, completely empty inside. I just thought it was a tremendous story, and artificial intelligence is another one of the themes I kind of identified running through this book. I mean, there's a number of stories that deal. A couple I wrote down here: Survival Guide, Beyond the Dragon's Gate, Skipping Stones in the Dark, and Brother Rifle. Just off the bat, I'll deal with artificial intelligence in different ways.
Yeah. I totally noticed that before you said it just now.
I mean, John, is that you see did you notice any AI themes running through these stories?
I mean, over the course of, I mean, I'd be curious to see if maybe Veronica just sort of mostly gravitated toward those, and or if the percentage is similar throughout the whole 80. I doubt that's the case. And it might just be that it was a very good year for AI stories. So coinciding with maybe Veronica's unknowing preference for such things, or maybe newly discovered preference. But yeah, no, I don't know. I hadn't really thought about it until you guys were just pointing it out. So
I'd be curious, actually. I don't know how well you remember Skipping Stones in the Dark, or if you read it recently, but I mean, I definitely want to reread it. But kind of my take when I got to the end of it was kind of like, oh, I feel like this is like a this is like a story. Maybe if it was like Hal from 2001, if a story was told from his point of view, making him seem like it's logical what he's doing. That was kind of, if I went back and reread it, that was kind of what I wanted to look at, if that was sort of, the best interpretation of the events of the story.
I think that's a smart connection to make, because it definitely strikes me that way. Like, while I was reading it, I was surprised by how many horrifying things I was like willing to go along with from this narrator's perspective. And I think that's ultimately why I was like, we have to include this one, because it forced me into a completely unreal or unhuman mindset and made it feel believable and even like, pretty reasonable to me while I was reading it. As just like ejecting people into space. It's like, yeah, it seems necessary.
Well, yeah,
it's very skillful.
Yeah, I think there's just something about a character who's like a character voice that seems calm and rational and authoritative, and that can take you a long way before you start being like, wait, is this a good idea?
Yes.
Does anyone have anything else they wanted to add about any of those AI stories I mentioned? Beyond the Dragon's Gate, Brother Rifle, Survival Guide?
Yeah, Beyond the Dragon's Gate was another one of those stories that seemed, it seemed obvious, like I should have seen it done before, because it's essentially about, an AI that occupies a physical body, which is a ship, I think, a spaceship. It's been a little bit since I've read that one.
Starships, yeah.
Yeah, starships. And then when you alter the physical body, the AI experiences dysphoria. And that seemed like, of course, that might be the case, because, like, I don't know, kind of examining like the interplay between your consciousness and your physical form. I don't know, just seems like an obvious thing to examine with AI. And then also the way it relates to dysphoria in trans people. I don't know, it just seemed like such a clear parallel to make. Anyway, I thought that one was very special in that regard, and that was sort of a new AI concept to introduce.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. Yeah, that again, it's kind of like, oh, how come this hasn't been done before? It's like, yeah, it's just so interesting how you can keep coming up with new ideas, even after.
Yeah, you feel like everything's been done, but it hasn't quite.
Yeah, I mean, Yohanca, were there any other stories in the book that you wanted to touch on?
Well, I remember.
Put you on the spot.
Yeah. Well, I was revisiting Let's Play Dead this morning, because I've been sort of rationing the stories out for myself because I listen to them while I walk, and I find it to be such a delightful way of moving through the stories. A plug here for the audiobook is what I'm saying. But Let's Play Dead was a really interesting story in terms of like how it was moving across time. You know, like it had that like there was a Tom and Jerry dynamic that got increasingly more and more brutal. Like at one point, the guy does draw a canyon and she falls into it.
Oh my gosh, Tom and Jerry. That's such a good way of. I had never thought about that, but you're totally right.
I mean,
that
in
is
the
dynamic.
Yeah, in the most gory and brutal, horrible way.
Yes.
Oh man, we're getting blurb after blurb here. Like, you know, let's get that on the cover of her collection.
Let's just describe the premise of the story. So it's sort of like it describes a relationship between a man and a woman, and it's kind of like dreamlike and surreal, and it's sort of like shifting. And sometimes it seems like it's talking about people living in modern times, and sometimes it seems like it's talking about Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. But basically, the man keeps murdering the woman, and then she keeps not being dead, and it's in this very sort of dreamlike kind of shifting reality sort of way. And sort of it's in a kind of like a fairy tale voice throughout.
And it's very funny
until
it's not, which is the best part about it.
Yeah, but it was kind of reminds me of like the way it's told is sort of like Kelly Link's Travels with the Snow Queen, or like some of Amy Bender's stories, where it's this kind of like fairy tales mixed with modern times, mixed with absurdism, sort of.
Worth clocking here is the appearance of an intrepid cockroach.
Yes.
We're tracking the vermin.
Vermin watch.
Mm-hmm.
Wait, remind me about what was the cockroach?
It's very small, but there's a passage where the protagonist finds a cockroach and like makes a path for it instead of killing it, and then imagines imagines it being her and her having thousands and thousands of babies, or millions of babies even, and surviving like forever.
That's interesting. It didn't occur to me that we might have had a whole vermin theme running through lots of these stories. I'll have to think about it.
Okay, well, clearly I have to put together like an AI vermin anthology.
I would love a vermin anthology. I would 100% read it.
Same.
All right, well, okay, let me get my agent on the horn.
3 readers.
Yeah.
There you go.
I mean, Crowdfather is kind of a vermin story, I guess, right?
I was going to bring that up. Crowdfather was one of the... Okay, so maybe you should... If we're going to talk about it, you should maybe explain the premise first.
Yeah, so there's this family, I think in like Minnesota or something, and they get together every summer for a family reunion, and I think like, I forget the details, but one of their like grandparents was killed by this giant crawdad that lives in this underwater cave on this lake that they go to every year. And so it's just a family tradition that every year they go and do battle with this giant crawdad with like bows and arrows and like spiked baseball bats and stuff like that. And so every year they fight it, and most of the time nobody dies, but they're not able to kill it. And this has been going on for, I don't know, 30 years or something.
Yes. And it's so funny. It asks you to kind of step into this like completely absurd world of this family. And so it's like the wacky family via giant Midwestern crawdad. It's so like, I think I explained it to like 5 people after I read it, and that's how I knew that I had to choose it. It's like, I was so delighted by it, I couldn't even process. But then it has like a real emotional undercurrent, kind of like the things that tie families together. And I don't know, I can't say more without like ruining the story. But anyway, it's not just funny, it has a lot of depth to it, I think. But it was just sorry, I'm laughing just thinking about it. Oh my god.
Yeah, well, yeah, I don't want to. I really liked the ending, and I don't want to give away the ending, but it's one of these things that you sort of like keep chewing on long after the story is over, and the author's note is kind of interesting. And again, I won't go into details, but yeah, like it is, it's not just a story about people fighting a giant crawdad, right? It has like, it operates on a metaphorical level as well, and a lot of these stories do. Like if you read the author's notes at the back of the book, like so many of these stories, like are dealing with really serious issues in this sort of metaphorical way, that a lot of like the best fantasy and science fiction does. I guess I definitely, one of the stories I wanted to talk about is called The Pill. I was just totally blown away by this story. But the premise is that they invent this diet pill that causes you to lose tons and tons of weight very, very rapidly. But about 1 in 10 people who take it die. And people want to lose weight so much that this doesn't really stop people from taking it. And so it's just sort of this, so pretty quickly everybody in society becomes skinny. And there's this sort of carnage that happens kind of off, out of people's, that people don't really talk about, or, that it's sort of, I don't know how to put it, but there's just like so many lines in the story that are just like such a gut punch. I'll just read one. So there's a part where the father is about to undergo, the story focuses on this family. It's like a father and mother and daughter and son. And the mother says at one point, the father's about to undergo that. He's about to start taking the pill. And the mother says, "I can't wait for you kids to see what your dad really looks like." And the daughter says, "I just sat there wondering if I was real. Are fat people fake? Do we not have souls? Does nothing I do count if I do it while I'm fat?" And there's just a lot of lines in the story like that just like, yeah, that just really hit you.
Yeah.
The story blew me away. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
I was just going to say, the story blew me away, and I also flagged that line as such an incredible...
Oh, wow.
Such an incredible argument or, question. Sorry, Veronica, I cut you off.
No, it's fine. I also remember that line, and I was going to say, I think this story made me the most uncomfortable in that it really made me contend with myself in a new way. I think because I had never thought about like the difficulties that arise when trying to occupy a space that's like built for very thin people. Like I think there's a moment where she can't sit in like a normal chair because now everybody is thin, so it's even worse than it is now. But like Meg says in her note at the back of the book, like this story isn't really that. It's not really that science fictional. Like it's really very, very real. And so I don't know. It's such a powerful story, and that it kind of makes you look at the world around you in a new way. At least if you're me and you haven't really thought about this that much before. So it was a really challenging story in a lot of ways, which I was really impressed with.
John, what did you think of the pill?
No, I mean, I thought it was amazing. It was one of those where I was like really glad to see it get like sort of widespread acclaim. Because like I had found it because I had read other Meg Ellison stories before, and thought she was great. And then so when this came out, it was in it was published in this like small collection of hers, and I wasn't sure as many people would see it that should see it. But then it got nominated for the Nebula and the Hugo, so that was very cool to see, because I think when you have stories like this that like I think like as Veronica was saying, it's like it to a lot of people, it's like this is going to be the first time you think about these things in this way. And again, like you were saying, Veronica, that it's not really that science fictional. So it's like it's really great when you have stories like this that are so powerful and so well done, but then also like you have this other element to it that it's like, oh well, no, this is like actually revelatory for a lot of people. And I love the way sort of these stories like this just like really make you think about maybe think about the world in a new way. So
Yeah, I mean, one way in which the story is science fictional in a really good way is that, it doesn't just present the idea and then stick with that static situation. It keeps complicating it and keeps introducing these new twists and everything. And so at one point, after the pill has become really widespread, there's a line that says, they weren't making it illegal to be fat exactly, but it was as close as they could get. It was going to be legal to deny health insurance to anyone with a BMI over 25 if they refused the pill. Intentional obesity would also be grounds for loss of child custody and would be acceptable reason for dismissal from a job. And, one of the things that is often said about science fiction, I forget actually exactly who said it, but, that like a science fiction writer, your job is not to predict the automobile, right? Like anyone could predict the automobile. Your job is to predict the interstate highway system and the suburbs and stuff like that, to look at sort of the second order effects of these technological changes. And so I thought that this story functioned really well in that way as a science fiction story, where it's not just like, how does this this new technology affect the protagonist? I mean, it certainly goes into that, but also how does it affect the wider society and everything like that, which I thought was really good.
It also just reflects such a deep awareness of what people are like. I sometimes, you read a story with kind of a wild premise and you think that the people in the story are not behaving the way that people behave. And that's always really frustrating for me and something that will really put me off a story. But in this one, I never have for a moment doubted that with a 1 in 10 chance of death, and not to mention even the people who survive the pill go through extreme physical agony to get this result. Whatever. I never had trouble believing that this would become a widespread thing because of how fat phobic we are and how uncomfortable we make life for bigger people.
Yeah.
I was just oh, okay, yeah, obviously. And I think she knows that when she's writing it. So she doesn't really have to justify it. It's this is, you know it, I know it, this is how people would be. So I thought that was just really smart.
Yeah. In terms of the, it was really good science fiction in the sense that, how the pill works is that it breaks down it rapidly breaks down your fat cells, and then they have to go somewhere, right? And so they pass very agonizingly through your bowels. And so it is it's not just magic. It's thinking about some of those, logistics of that kind of thing. And then also, in terms of the psychology of people, I want to read just one more section from the story. This is when people, these 1 in 10 people are dying and having funerals and stuff. And it says, but everyone was so proud of them that they had died trying to better themselves, that all the obituaries and eulogies had a weird, wistful tone to them, as if it was the next best thing to being thin. At least they didn't have to live that fat life anymore. So just there's so many lines like that. They're just, All right, cool. Any, Yohanca, any other thoughts about the pill?
I love this story, and I think I think you guys touched on it a little bit too, but this idea of blurring the lens, turning the dial just a little bit on something that already exists, because there are all these weight loss methods that are extremely risky and dangerous, and people do them anyway. And I think this idea of I remember when one of the, I don't want to do too many spoilers, but there's a moment when one of the characters undergoes this, takes the pill, and the line is, it gave her someone else's life entirely, so it's you're living this completely different life if you were in a fat body. And I think the way that the story escalates and as you were saying, complicates that is really fascinating. How the world gets smaller. There was a point where she's the stairs were getting complicated. The stairs were too small. So it's the buildings, everything was changing at a structural level. And I think that was just such a beautiful carrying through of the technology and this shift in how people were behaving. Yeah, I loved it. It blew me away.
Yeah, well, you mentioned there's real procedures, some of which carry really high risks. I mean, Meg Ellison actually says in the author's note that the story was inspired by, it was her friend's mom or something died from complications of a some surgical weight loss kind of procedure. So, yeah. So, it's a kind of another way in which, she says this is not really fiction, this story. All right. So Veronica, any other stories from the book you wanted to
oh my God. Well, I love them all. I'm not very.
Yeah, I would hope so.
Yeah.
But I guess I do want to point out The Cleaners by Ken Liu, because that one really affected me too. It's the premise of it is that it's like in a kind of alternate universe, modern feeling, where we leave impressions on objects, like of memories. And there's,
physical deposits of memories.
Yes. Yeah. And it's, then obviously like the new business that would arise in that alternate universe is that someone's got to clean those deposits off of objects in case people don't want to because then the resale shops become very complicated, for example. Anyway, I just, I thought that one was really, obviously I think they're all excellent. Otherwise I wouldn't have selected them out of 80. But
I could just say about the Ken Liu story, his author's note was interesting too, because he was invited to write a story for a retelling of fairy tales kind of anthology. And so he's like, well, I didn't want to do just a normal retelling of fairy tales. So I decided to do kind of like a retelling of The Princess and the Pea. And if you read the story, this is pretty far removed from The Princess and the Pea. But it's the same idea of people having different levels of sensitivity to something. And, so the story revolves around these three characters who are, one who just can't experience the memories from these deposits at all. One of whom has sort of a normal level of sensitivity to them, and then one who's hypersensitive and has to wear gloves and avoid touching anything because she's so overwhelmed by these memories. And so I just thought that was an interesting sort of insight into where a story like this can come from, because it is so obviously so different from The Princess and the Pea.
It was sort of connected in my mind to the rat, actually, because it's not that the rat in the story, the rat is necessarily like a memory or something, but the rat is sort of like grief embodied physically, and The Cleaners is like memories embodied physically. So this idea of having to encounter these things that are so difficult for us and finding them to be unavoidable and because they've taken a shape in front of us was an interesting connection. I don't know. It clearly spoke to me since I picked them both. Yeah, it was pretty brilliant.
See, John, are there any other topics you want to bring up or stories you wanted to highlight?
I was just thinking that I should mention that when you were asking about the magazines that had ceased publication and some had come back from the dead. So one of them that came back from the dead is Fantasy Magazine, which I publish. I'm not the editor. The editor is it's edited by the team of Arlie Sorg, who works at Locus and has been on staff at Lightspeed for a long time, and Christy Yant, who is my wife, but also was our pod turn back in the day and is an award-winning editor in her own right. But she so she and Arlie are doing that, and I just figured, people who listen to this show tend to like my stuff sometimes, and so it's like, well, you should make sure that they're aware that exists. But yeah, that was super cool because and actually this story was I think it was in their first issue, or it was certainly, they had 2 issues last year, so it was in one of those first 2 issues. You're
talking about, and this is how to stay alive, right?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So that was very cool to see.
Yeah, that's great that you guys were able to bring back Fantasy Magazine, because I remember kind of how much you were sort of struggling to keep everything going back in the day, and that sort of you were able to do that. Right.
Yeah. So just real quick, it's a little weird because when I took over as publisher of Lightspeed. I also took over as publisher of Fantasy, and then at that time I ended up merging Fantasy into Lightspeed. So Lightspeed went from a science fiction magazine to a science fiction and fantasy magazine, and then Fantasy was sort of like discontinued at that time. And then we brought it back a couple of times when we did our special issues for the Destroy project, but then otherwise it hadn't been its own thing. And so now it's kind of like this weird space because we kept Lightspeed the same. So Lightspeed still is science fiction and fantasy. So it's still basically including the old fantasy. It's, and so it's like this new fantasy is kind of a clone of the original fantasy, which seems like it's more of a science fictional thing, but I don't know. Maybe it's a ghost. I don't know.
Well, people like fantasy, so you can never have too much fantasy, right?
Yeah.
All right. So, any other topics anyone wants to bring up before we start wrapping this up?
I mean, I just want to also talk about, just briefly, Two Truths and a Lie by Sarah Pinsker, which made me realize that maybe I should read more horror because it was so very unsettling. And you really can't explain anything about it because it sort of spoils it, but it was very unsettling and really creepy and great. So open your mind to horror, everyone. The overlap is, bigger than you think, actually, between science fiction, especially, I think, and fantasy.
Well, it was funny too, because in her author's note, she says that she doesn't usually write horror. And it's a really creepy story. And she said that even Ellen Datlow was creeped out by it. So she said that was quite an accomplishment to creep out Ellen Datlow when you're not typically a horror writer. Yeah.
Creeped out.
I guess, John, you mentioned in your intro, you say that Veronica, I learned that she was a huge fan of Frank Herbert's Dune and the works of Madeleine L'Engle and Philip K. Dick. So I was just curious, Veronica, do you have a Dune fever right now?
Yeah, I do. I saw it in the theater. I watched it again 2 days later. I immediately started writing. Just, when you see something that really hits you in a good spot, you end up wanting to make things again. Sometimes, at least that's what happened to me with that movie. And then I've been listening to the soundscapes that's supposed to go with the movie companion art or whatever. I'm completely gone. I was so happy that they greenlit the second one. So, yep, Dune fever. I've got it.
I thought you were about to say that you watched it twice, and then you went home and started writing ... Dune fanfic.
No,
because there's a bit of a pause right when you started saying that. I was waiting for Dune fanfic to come in there, but okay. I'm glad that that's writing original stuff.
Yes, yeah. Still haven't dipped a toe into fanfic, but I'm sure there's great Dune fanfic out there now, especially with Chalamet and Zendaya in the lead roles. Sure, it's caught some people's imaginations.
So what you were saying that they have, this is different from than the soundscapes in the movie, or
so there's there's the score, that you hear in the movie, and then there's an art book that goes along with the movie's release, and I think it's still Hans Zimmer, I think, but he made a little mellower kind of album you can find. At least I found it on Spotify. Anyway, and so because it's a little mellower, you can kind of write to it without feeling really stressed, which is how I would feel if I were listening to the score. Anyway, so look it up. It's good.
Yeah, because we talked about it we talked about the movie last week, but I thought the sound design was just so stunning in that movie. So
yeah,
I can see.
It was good. The bagpipes, when the bagpipes came in, it's oh God. Yep.
I also just did want to mention, because we obviously have a lot of John fans who listen to this podcast, and so I just wanted to mention that you want to tell your story about how you got your dog? Do you have any advice for people who lose their dogs and how they can get them back?
Well, sure. So I mean, I recently had my dog run off on me. He got spooked when I was out on a walk with him, and I did everything wrong. if you read the internet advice, which was like, chasing him and, calling his name and all those things, those are not likely to work when a dog runs off when they're scared and spooked. But anyway, so he got away and he was missing for like 12 days. And so,
Oh my God.
yeah, it was terrible. And so what we did was we looked up all of the different like Facebook groups that are devoted to finding lost pets, and just posted on all of those for that were local to where I live. And then we went on Nextdoor and did the same thing there, and was just trying to engage the community as much as possible. And then of course we put up some flyers around town, like tried to find like different intersections and things where people would likely to slow down to be able to see it. And ultimately, that's one of those things is what helped us find him, because we had gotten a lot of sightings, and we had gone and looked in the area where the sightings had happened, and we just never saw him. And then the day before we found him, we were following up on a sighting, and Christy actually saw him. And
wow.
we weren't together at the time. Like, I was looking in a different area, and so she actually saw him, and she tried to follow the advice, which was, don't call him, don't like approach him or anything. Sit on the ground and don't look at him, and like pretend like you're eating treats or something, because it's like, and
Oh
and
my
I
God.
swear this is what they say to do. And maybe that does work with some dogs, and maybe that would work for a dog that doesn't know you. But in this case, when we were sort of examining the situation after the fact, Christy was like, I think like he thought it was me, but then when I wasn't excited to see him, he turned away and was like, "Oh, that can't be
Oh,
Mama. She'd be excited to see me."
oh
Um,
God.
so obviously, yeah, that was pretty upsetting, to have that thought, and also that we didn't get him. We saw him and we didn't get him. But then fortunately the next day, I woke up to a text, and somebody had just seen him. And so I went down there, and I was driving around and I didn't see him. And so I was like, damn it, again, we just barely missed him. But then somebody called me, and the guy had just literally seen him, and I was already in the area. So it's like I didn't have to have any travel time, or like, I had to get dressed time and all that kind of stuff. I was already there. So I went over there, and after the experience of the day before, we were like, okay, just forget it. If we see him again, we're gonna call him. We're gonna treat him like our dog,
Yeah.
and like understanding him as we do, and we're just going to go with it. And so I went to where the guy had pointed, and he said he was just like in these trees over here. And so I had some of his toys, so I was like bouncing one of his tennis balls on the ground, so he could hear that and maybe smell it. And I took one of his bones and was picking it up and throwing it on the street, to have that sound that it makes. And I had some treats and stuff. And then so eventually I was just like playing with the treats and dropping them, and I'm like, oh, I sure wish that there was a dog over here I could give some treats to. And then he bursts out of the woods, and he looks at me, and he's just kind of standing there like frozen. And I saw him, and I did the whole super excited thing. It's like, Krim, come here, buddy. And I got down like I was gonna play, doing the let's play sort of sign that dogs do. And yeah, he just ran right up to me, and he was like just so excited. He was like vibrating. And this is like a 70-pound German Shepherd, so it's like it's a lot when he gets like that. But it was super exciting, and so it's like, yeah, I was so relieved, because he just ran right to me, and then I got him in the car as quickly as possible. And so yeah,
I'm
that's
so glad
that's
you
about
got
all you
him
could
back.
do. Yeah, I know,
What a
me too.
relief.
Thank you. Yeah.
So what should I do, John, if I lose my pet rat or cockroach?
Well, talk to your local knife salesman, and see if they've had any sightings, because I understand that they encounter those a lot. I don't know. Well, see, what you do is you get yourself a dragon, and they're specially trained to find these things.
The hardest to find would be the Ciguapa.
Yeah,
saying.
well, true. Yeah.
Mhm.
They do run very fast, so.
Yeah. And in both directions.
Yeah.
She could have helped me catch this German Shepherd, who also runs very, very fast.
Yeah, there you go.
That was the problem initially.
It's wild. 12 days?
Yeah.
Is that how long? Oh my
Yeah.
gosh.
Yeah, and we found him 4 miles away.
Wow.
Oh, I will say there is one other thing that we did. So we have a neighbor who has this really loud dog, and I had seen some advice that said like you could try getting a dog that your dog knows to go into the area where you think he might be, so that they can smell him and maybe they'll come to that familiar smell, or if they bark or whatever. And so this dog is super loud, like barks like is the biggest woofer, and just like real resonant. And so my neighbor actually suggested we take her and go over. It's like, oh great, well, because I had that thought, but I didn't want to impose on them, And so this dog, who is so loud all the time, she didn't make a single peep the whole time when we went out with her. She did mark everything in sight. So I do suspect she may have cracked the case. I mean, because we found him we definitely had gone right where I found him. We had definitely gone the day before. We definitely went right where I ended up finding Grim. So yeah.
So you think he smelled this other dog? And
maybe, yeah, maybe, yeah. I mean, he might have saw like, hey, that smells like home, But
yeah. That's great. Yeah. All right, but we need to start wrapping this up. So let's get into some final thoughts. So Yohanca, any final thoughts on this whole experience of being in and reading Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy?
It's a dream come true for all of us science fiction and fantasy writers, and being chosen by both John and Veronica. Like, it's just, dream come true. It's amazing. And the collection is so beautiful. Because I honestly, like, the genre divisions sometimes don't make much sense to me, because I feel like a good story is a good story, And like all the stories, I haven't read all of them yet because I've been, like I said, listening to the audiobook, but the ones I've read so far are so gorgeous and so like richly imagined. And I feel so lucky to have some work in the book this year.
Yeah. And how about Veronica? Final thoughts?
Well, I'm just like rediscovering how much I loved all of these. I think there's kind of something for everyone. If you're more of like a sort of hard sci-fi reader, you'll be introduced to some new people, and if you're on the other end of things, like not such a short fiction reader at all, this is like a really good place to start if you love genre fiction, or even if you only kind of like genre fiction. So that's my sales pitch for the anthology. But I think it's such a good selection of the kind of work that people are doing, more everywhere from more grounded to like completely different worlds. I don't know, it's just like a really good range of stories, and some really beautiful stories in there. I really feel like I learned a lot as a writer, so I don't know, very special experience. Thanks for asking me to do it, John.
Oh yeah, no, I was thrilled to have you. So I'm always glad when the guest editor enjoys the experience. I mean, I think everyone has said that they did, and I hope that was actually true of everyone who said that. But it's a really cool experience to doing it every year with a different person like this. So I'm really glad it's worked out every time so far, the way it has. Yeah, and so like in some cases, like with you, Veronica, I'd gotten to know you fairly well, having edited your novel and everything. We had all these different marketing calls and everything, and all this different discussion and emails and everything. So it's like I felt like we got to know each other pretty well. Some of the other guest editors I didn't know nearly as well. So I mean, it's just interesting to me how it's like, oh, it's always gone great, even though like it doesn't matter if I knew the person well or didn't know them at all. I'm glad that it's continued in that vein.
Yeah, and just again, John, like I've said this before, but I mean, I think it's just so great that you're able to do this. Like the Best American series is such a sort of cultural touchstone or something, and and it was a shame that they didn't have a science fiction and fantasy one for so many years, and it's great that now that they do, then that you're doing it, and it makes me happy to every time I see Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy at the bookstore. So,
yeah. Well, thanks. And yeah, I mean, it was a huge honor to me to to get this off the ground like we did, and I've been really thrilled that we've been able to keep it going all this time. And there will be at least one more volume, and then we have to wait for the publisher to renew it after that. But that's sort of been par for the course over the last couple of years, where it's like, okay, well, we know we're doing the next one, and then we'll see. But I mean, I don't see any reason why it wouldn't keep continuing. The only slight hiccup is that HMH, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, the publisher, got merged into HarperCollins. Was it last year or recently? Anyway, maybe it was this year. I guess it was this year. And so I don't have any reason to think that would mean that they would nix it, but it throws a big variable into the mix, and so who knows? But hopefully it'll keep going for a long, long time, and we can keep bringing these awesome selections to everybody. And I hope that we're broadening the audience for science fiction and fantasy and for short stories. Because it's like, this is where my heart is, and I want people to know that all this awesome stuff exists. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's a good note to end on. So let's wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with John Joseph Adams, Veronica Roth, and Johanka Delgado. So thanks everyone so much for joining us.
Great to be here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Thank you.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to John Joseph Adams, Veronica Roth, and Johanka Delgado for joining us on the show. And remember that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please support us on Patreon over at patreon.com/geeks, or via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.